The Dark Magician has had a lot of support created for him over the years, and some support which is obviously created for Dark Magician, but doesn't specifically name him in the card. So this list will go over 10 of the not so good Dark Magician cards. And at number 10, we have Magician's Defense, arguably the best card on this list. This is a continuous trap card, which has an effect where, if you control a spellcaster type monster, any damage you take is cut in half, which, okay, kind of weak effect. Sort of like the Sanctuary in the Sky type deal, which works on effect damage as well. And its second effect is a floating effect, where if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can special summon a spellcaster type monster from your graveyard. Now, this floating effect is actually not half bad, and the way it floats is in one of the best possible ways, as it just needs to be sent there to the graveyard from the field, and doesn't need to be sent in a specific way. So, if you tribute this card in order to bring out something like Vision Hero Witch Raider, you can activate its effect in order to special summon a monster from your grave. It also just works if your opponent destroys it. It's pretty good because there's not a lot of spell and traps which float, which is why cards like Heavy Storm are banned, and why cards like Dark Hole rarely see that much play. There is just a significant more amount of monsters which float than there are spell and traps. So this card's kind of unique in that respect, but it's still not the best, and doesn't really see any play. And at number 9, we have Black Illusion. This is a normal trap card with the effect that, for the rest of the turn, all of your dark spellcaster type monsters with more than 2,000 attack basically become immune to everything from your opponent. And also their effects are negated. Now, just like Magician's Defense, this card doesn't really list Dark Magician specifically, but it's still very obviously a Dark Magician support card, as it has the staff wand thing in the picture, and its very specific thing that it protects is obviously meant for Dark Magician Girl and Dark Magician cards. Now, the reason this card is on this list is because that's all it does. It just protects your Dark Magician cards for one turn from your opponent, and doesn't really do anything else. In fact, it has a negative effect of negating their effects as well. Now, there is another Dark Magician card called Eternal Soul, which grants your Dark Magician cards with basically immunity from your opponent's effects, and also allows you to search out a card every turn, or special summon a Dark Magician from your graveyard. It's much better, even if it also has a negative effect when destroyed. And generally, protection-like effects are not really played, unless the protection is a byproduct of some other effect, whereas the protection is the full effect of this card, making it kinda mediocre, but still pretty good when compared to some of the other cards on this list. And at number 8, we have Miracle Restoring. With this card, you can remove 2 spell counters from your side of the field to special summon a Dark Magician from your graveyard. Or Buster Blader, it works on either or. Now, the intended synergy for this card is with Skilled Dark Magician, which was a pretty decent level 4 monster that gains a spell counter on it every time a spell card is activated. And when it reaches 3 spell counters, you can tribute the card to special summon a Dark Magician from your hand deck or graveyard. So Dark Magicians having spell counter support isn't too far-fetched, since a lot of the spell counter cards also have to do with spellcasters. That being said, do you know how many other spell counter cards are part of the Dark Magician archetype? The answer is the 2 I just listed, and that's it. Dark Magicians don't really care about spell counters outside of Skilled Dark Magician, who also doesn't really care about spell counters either, because Skilled Dark Magician is kind of slow and never played in modern Dark Magician decks. Although to be fair, Miracle Restoring is an old card, just like Skilled Dark Magician, and saw just as little play back then as it does now, as all it does is special summon Dark Magician from the grave, where Eternal Soul does that 10 times better. There's just a lot of other Dark Magician cards that do much better jobs of bringing out Dark Magician, where setting a trap card, waiting a turn, needing 2 spell counters on the field, all to bring out a level 7 monster who needs to be set up in the graveyard first, is just not very good. And at number 7, we have Sorcerer of Dark Magic. This card can only be special summoned from your hand by tributing 2 level 6 or higher spellcaster type monsters. So obviously a Dark Magician support card, and has an effect where it can negate the effects of activated trap cards for basically no cost, and has 3200 attack. So, for the low cost of tributing 2 high-level spellcaster type monsters, you can bring out a Jinzo with 800 more attack. It's basically just a beefier Jinzo that's much harder to bring out. And hey, to be fair, Jinzo is a good card, and 3200 is a pretty decent stat line. But its summoning cost isn't really worth all of that, as it doesn't really do much more to impact the field. It just negates traps and is a beat stick, which would be fine if this was an extra deck monster, but the fact that it's a main deck monster with tough summoning requirements kinda puts it into the category of Neos Wise Man, cards with technically decent effects, completely ruined by tough summoning requirements. And at number 6, we have Magician's Valkyria. This is a level 4 monster with 1600 attack, which has an effect where your opponent can't attack your other spellcaster type monsters except for this card. So it's like a battle redirection ability, and the card looks very similar to Dark Magician Girl, making it Dark Magician support. At least for this list anyway. I don't really care if it's official Dark Magician support or not. Now, what's not so great about this effect is that this monster has no business trying to be the attack target of your opponent's monsters. It's kind of weak at 1600 attack, and its effect only works when it's face up, so no setting it face down in defense position. But if you do set it face down, it does have 1800 defense, putting it on par with something like setting an Ash Blossom. That being said, if you do manage to get 2 copies of this card out, it does lock your opponent from being able to attack you, as long as you don't summon any other non-spellcaster type monsters. So if you really want, you could try your best to turbo out 2 copies of these cards in order to protect your spellcasters from attacks. A similar feat can be accomplished with Marauding Captain, who is able to facilitate this combo by himself with a copy of himself. So Magician's Valkyria is like a slightly worse Marauding Captain, which doesn't make it absolutely terrible, just not super useful outside of, say, a lockdown Secret Village of the Spellcaster deck. And at number 5, we have Diffusion Wave-Motion, a card which has caused a lot of troubles for fusion searchers, as it unfortunately has fusion in its name, despite not being a fusion card. Now, Diffusion Wave-Motion is kind of like a Feather Shot for Dark Magician, whereas Feather Shot is a useless hero card because it only targets one really low attack vanilla monster. At least Diffusion Wave-Motion works on any level 7 or higher spellcaster, and what this card does is allow your level 7 or higher spellcaster to attack all of your opponent's monsters. And if it destroys any of them by battle, it will negate their effects, which will prevent them from floating or activating any flip or graveyard effects, all at the cost of 1000 life points, requiring a high-level spellcaster type monster, and not allowing any of your other monsters to attack for that turn. That is to say, it's kind of hard to pull off, and its effect is honestly not that good, as all it does is allow that one monster to attack all of your opponent's monsters, and I guess prevent floating, which is alright. I guess calling it not very good is a little too extreme. It's just kind of mediocre. Generally, for a card to be good, it has to provide some kind of advantage, be easy to play, or win you the game on its own, and this card doesn't really do any of those things. It's just situationally useful. And at number 4, we have Dark Magician Knight. This is a monster card with the same exact attack and defense as Dark Magician, and has an effect that, when it's special summoned, you can destroy one card on the field. Now, being able to destroy any one card on the field is a pretty good effect. The only problem with this card is how you summon it. You see, this card must be special summoned with Knight's Title, which is a normal spell card whose only effect is to tribute a Dark Magician in order to special summon a Dark Magician Knight from your hand, deck, or graveyard, which feels like a pretty easy to pull off effect in a Dark Magician deck, right? And it's that simplicity which will kind of trick you into thinking that this card is better than it really is. Then you have to think about this card's consistency. If you draw into Dark Magician Knight, it's a Garnet in hand. You do not want to ever draw this card, you want it to stay in the deck. When this card comes out and replaces Dark Magician, it's no longer counted as Dark Magician on the field, so it doesn't benefit from the plethora of Dark Magician support cards. And then there's Knight's Title. You have to search out this specific spell card, who luckily does have 2 Dark Magician cards that can search it out for you. So getting the card isn't that bad, And even then, it just replaces the Dark Magician on the field with another card that only destroys one other card on the field. So it's like a worse version of a Monarch. As Caius the Shadow Monarch, its effect activates when it's tribute summoned, by attributing any monster you control, and then allows you to banish any card on the field, with only 100 less attack. Whereas Dark Magician Knight requires you to use a specific spell card that also requires you to tribute a specific monster, the Dark Magician, who himself is a level 7 normal monster, so it's pretty difficult to get out. Because bringing out Dark Magician Knight requires 2 cards, one of which is a Garnet in hand as you have to play it in your main deck, that kind of ruins the viability of this card, where it would be much better if Dark Magician Knight could just special summon itself from your hand by tributing a Dark Magician, but the fact that it requires a spell card is just enough of a hindrance to make this card bad. And at number 3, we have Dark Sage. This is one of the few cards in the game which can special summon itself from the deck, which is pretty neat, and also one of the few cards in the game that allows you to search any spell card when it's summoned. Being able to search out any spell card is an effect so rare that the only cards that can do it are generally hard to bring out, or have huge drawbacks for using that effect. Dark Sage falls into the former category of being hard to bring out, as in order to bring this card out from the deck, you need to have 2 specific monsters on the field, and then win a coin toss. Because you see, you need Dark Magician and Time Wizard on the field, and then you need Time Wizard to activate its effect and land on the head's result. And if you meet these 2 conditions of having both these cards on the field and activating Time Wizard's effect correctly, you can then tribute your Dark Magician in order to special summon Dark Sage straight from your hand or deck. Now, while this is a pretty neat interaction, what makes this card not very good is its 2-fold summoning conditions of requiring 2 specific monsters on the field and then winning a coin toss, which is absolutely terrible, especially since the Tails result will just destroy both of your monsters. But at the very least, you don't also need to have this card in your hand to special summon it, as it allows itself to be special summoned from the deck, which honestly makes it so much better that it's only the 3rd worst card on this list instead of the 1st. And at number 2, we have Magic Formula. This is an equipped spell card which can only be equipped to Dark Magician or Dark Magician Girl, and gives them 700 attack while it's equipped to them, and also, if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you gain 1000 life points. So it's an equipped card which gives a hefty chunk of attack and even has a floating effect. So what's so bad about this card? Well, it's an incredibly specific equip card that can only be equipped to 2 hard to summon monsters and only gives them an attack boost, and not even a very good attack boost. Axe of Despair, for example, can be equipped to any monster and gives them a 1000 attack boost, and existed around the same time this card came out. There's also Mage Power or United We Stand, 2 other equipped cards which can be equipped to any monster, and give them way more than 700 attack. Basically, an equipped card needs to be incredibly powerful to see play, and generally the only types of equipped cards that do see play are ones that either special summon a monster or steal one of your opponent's monsters. So the card itself is fine, it's just incredibly underpowered. Although its floating effect has seen some niche uses in certain OTK decks that themselves are kind of gimmicky. But other than that, a floating effect on a card like this, but only gives you life points, and a pretty minor amount at that, isn't very useful. And at number 1, we have Dark Flare Knight. This is a Dark Magician fusion monster that requires Dark Magician and the Flame Swordsman as fusion materials. And if I'm remembering correctly, this was the first fusion monster to require another fusion monster as one of its fusion materials, as the Flame Swordsman is a crappy vanilla fusion monster. And if not the first, it's one of the earliest versions of this kind of fusion material type thing, which meant it was really hard to bring out in its first incarnation, but you could always substitute Flame Swordsman with a fusion substitute monster, so it wasn't impossible to bring out. There's also the fact that it wasn't very good either, as this card has 300 less attack than Dark Magician. Usually, fusion monsters have higher stats than the monsters used to bring them out, but Dark Flare Knight is strictly a worse card, in terms of stat lines of course, it does also have an effect. The effect of this card is that you take no battle damage from battles involving this card. And that's because of its next effect. This card basically exists for its floating effect, where when this card is destroyed by battle, you can special summon a Mirage Knight from your deck. Now, before I talk about Mirage Knight, I should probably take a moment to talk about the fact that this is a fusion monster who floats into a main deck monster, and that main deck monster can only be summoned by the effect of Dark Flare Knight. Usually, the upside to fusion monsters is the fact that you don't have to play them in your main deck, and you can just bring them out whenever you fulfill the summoning conditions, while this card also requires you to play an unusable main deck monster. That is, if you want to use Dark Flare Knight's good effect, of course. And also, Dark Flare Knight only floats on battle destruction, so it's not even a good floating effect. Now, let's go over Mirage Knight. Mirage Knight is a 2800 attack monster who has an effect when attacking another monster to gain attack equal to the original attack of the monster it's battling. So basically, it has an honest effect for himself, which is pretty good. That means it can beat over pretty much anything. So if this card crashes into a monster who doesn't have its attack modified in any way, you're basically inflicting 2800 points of damage to your opponent, while also destroying one of your opponent's monsters by battle. Now, this would make this card really good, especially since its effect works during both players' turns, and works if this card both attacks into your opponent's monster, or is attacked by an opponent's monster. But here's the big downside of Mirage Knight. It banishes itself during the end phase of the turn in which it attacks, or is attacked. So not only is this card hard to bring out, you have to float into it through a hard to summon fusion monster, but it also only exists for one turn basically. Unless you choose not to attack with it, which is a shame because Mirage Knight actually has a really good battle effect. It's just everything else about the card that's bad. Now, with the release of the spell card, the Eye of Timaeus, going into Dark Flare Knight has been made way easier than it was in the past, as you can special summon it directly from the extra deck with just one copy of Dark Magician and then one copy of Eye of Timaeus. But even then, it's still a really clunky card and still not worth running it or Mirage Knight in your main deck. Alright, and that's the list. Honestly, a lot of these cards were just mediocre, not really bad. But if you know of any other worse Dark Magician cards that should have made the list, or have ideas for videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.